Imagine being a millionaire, used to the red carpet treatment everywhere you go. Until one day, you decide to strip it all away. Henry Smith, a wealthy entrepreneur from Los Angeles, disguised himself as an ordinary man and walked into a luxury car dealership. What happened next not only shocked him, but completely transformed his understanding of respect, dignity, and the true value of money. Before we start the story, comment below which city you are watching from. Enjoy the story. Henry Smith, a 48-year-old millionaire, had everything he could desire: a business empire, luxurious cars, and a life surrounded by privileges. But over time, something had started to bother him. He always wondered if people really saw him for who he was, or just for the value of his name and fortune. Life seemed to be an endless race, where money spoke louder than anything else. It was on a quiet afternoon that Henry had a daring idea. He decided he would go to luxury cars, a luxury car dealership in the city, but not as Henry Smith, the millionaire. He wanted to experience being treated like an ordinary person, without the privileges that his money provided him. It would be a simple yet revealing experiment. He would disguise himself as poor. The next day, Henry did exactly as he had planned. He abandoned the luxury car, the expensive watch, and the impeccable outfit. Instead, he wore a worn-out t-shirt and an old pair of jeans. He didn't wear brand-name sneakers, but a simple, well-worn model. His hair was messier, and he didn't even bother to shave. To complete the disguise, he took public transportation to the dealership, which, for him, seemed to be the last thing anyone in his position would do. Upon arriving at luxury cars, the first thing Henry noticed was the refined environment. The aroma of new leather, the soft lighting, the cars shining in their showcases. Everything was perfectly aligned with luxury and exclusivity. But Henry wasn't there to be admired. He wanted to see how people would treat him when they didn't know who he was. Upon entering, he wasn't greeted with the usual enthusiasm. No salesperson immediately approached, as would be expected when someone like Henry walked into a store. Instead, he was just another face, someone without visible status. Salesperson Mark was busy with another customer, and James, the other salesperson, didn't seem to care much. Henry stood there for a few minutes, observing and feeling invisible. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Henry approached Mark, who looked at him briefly, but showed no interest. "Can I help you with something?" Mark asked without much enthusiasm. Henry took a deep breath and, without hesitation, said, "I'd like to see the most expensive model you have." Mark looked him up and down, a doubtful expression passing over his face. He seemed to question whether Henry could really afford that car. "I think it might be better if we start with something more accessible. We don't want to show you something out of your reach, right?" Mark replied with a sly smile, trying to be friendly, but clearly doubting Henry's ability to pay for something so expensive. Henry, feeling the irritation begin to build inside him, remained calm and smiled back. "I insist. I want to see the most expensive model," he said firmly, without showing any sign of anger or frustration. Mark hesitated, but he nodded and walked away to get the keys to the car Henry had asked to see. Henry stood there in silence, absorbing what was happening. For him, the experience was already revealing. The way they treated him, as if he was incapable of buying a luxury car, was as clear as day. But he was there to learn something important: how people really saw him without the shine of his fortune, without the weight of his name. The feeling of being treated indifferently was making him reflect more than he had imagined. Henry Smith stood still for a few seconds after his request to see the most expensive model. The silence at luxury cars felt heavy, as if the mere idea of a man like him, with a simple appearance and modest clothes, was out of place in that luxury environment. Salesperson Mark, who had initially ignored him, seemed to finally realize that Henry wouldn't leave so easily. However, the expression on his face didn't indicate sympathy. On the contrary, he seemed unimpressed, almost uncomfortable. Mark looked at Henry as if evaluating him, but in a disguised way. His eyes scanned the simple t-shirt, the worn jeans, and the common sneakers, and for a moment, the salesperson seemed to doubt the request. He wasn't used to seeing this type of customer there. In his mind, Henry was nothing more than a curious onlooker, maybe someone without the money to even think about luxury cars. "Are you sure you want to see the most expensive model?" Mark asked, his voice loaded with doubt disguised as kindness. "I think a simpler model, maybe an entry-level sedan, would be more appropriate if you're looking for a real car." Henry heard the condescending tone, but remained impassive. He knew what was happening. It was clear that Mark didn't see him as someone with purchasing power, but rather as a person without the means to afford the kind of product the store offered. The salesperson, who was supposedly there to help, was actually underestimating his request, treating him as if he was incapable of paying for something more expensive. The irony wasn't lost on Henry. He knew he was being treated as if he were a misfit, a person of no importance in a scenario where his money and reputation would normally be the center of attention. He, who could buy the entire store, was being treated like just any customer. "I'm sure," Henry replied calmly but firmly. "I want to see the most expensive model, as I asked. I'm not interested in entry-level models." Mark hesitated for a moment, not knowing how to react. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone with such a common appearance. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable, and started walking towards the car, but his expression still showed a mix of doubt and superiority. Henry remained where he was, observing the salesperson's behavior with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Mark returned holding the keys to a car, but what he brought wasn't what Henry had asked for. Instead of the most expensive luxury car, Mark showed him a basic and economical model. It was a comfortable car, but not luxurious. Henry looked at the vehicle and immediately realized what was happening. "This is the entry-level model. Maybe it's more your style," Mark said with a corner smile, trying to disguise his attitude of superiority. "You don't want to spend more than this, do you?" Henry's smile disappeared. He felt the weight of Mark's words, the tone as if he was treating someone of a lower class. Mark, unknowingly, was treating Henry like a common customer, not even imagining that he was facing a millionaire. "I asked to see the most expensive car, not the entry-level model," Henry said firmly, making it clear that he wasn't interested in being treated that way. He wanted the luxury car, not the basic model that was being offered to him. He was starting to realize that his mere presence there wasn't enough to be treated with the respect he expected. Mark looked at him with an air of superiority, as if challenging him was something absurd, and even tried to change the subject. "Maybe you're mistaken, sir. I can show you a more affordable model. But honestly, this model here is the most suitable for someone without a large budget." Henry took a deep breath but maintained his calm posture. He knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't just an attempt to sell a car, it was a clear demonstration of how appearances and social status affect the way people are treated. Mark didn't see him as someone capable of making a substantial purchase. He was treating him condescendingly, assuming the customer didn't have the means to pay for what he really wanted. "I'm not looking for something suitable for my budget. I want the most expensive model," Henry insisted, now with a firmer tone of voice. He felt the frustration rising, but he knew he couldn't let it slide. He wanted to prove a point. At this moment, James, the other salesperson in the store, noticed the tension in the environment and approached, observing the interaction with a certain disdain. He looked at Henry as if evaluating a potential customer, but his expression didn't show any interest in helping him. Henry's impression was confirmed. James was just fulfilling his duty, without really caring about the sale or the service. He seemed as indifferent as Mark. "Can I help you?" James asked, but the tone of his voice suggested more an attempt to dismiss the customer than to actually provide good service. Henry felt frustration taking over him. He had been underestimated in a way he couldn't have imagined. But it was also becoming interesting. He was starting to understand how people viewed wealth, not as a tool for respect or recognition, but as a form of power. And he was there to test that power, to see how far those salespeople would go. "Yes, you can," Henry replied, now with a more serious expression. "I'm interested in the most expensive model, and I would like you to show it to me now." The two salesmen, Mark and James, exchanged glances, uncomfortable with Henry's insistence, but they were not willing to give in. Neither of them knew they were standing before someone who could buy the entire store. They saw him just as a normal customer, and they were treating him as such. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type breakfast if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now, let's get back to the story. After being ignored by Mark and James, Henry felt his patience beginning to wear thin. The environment at luxury cars, which should have been a place of sophistication and professionalism, now seemed oppressive and loaded with uncomfortable tension. He was there to buy a luxury car, but it seemed the only thing he was receiving was disdain. His eyes scanned the displayed cars, but nothing seemed to matter as much as the frustration he felt being treated with such indifference. It was at that moment, when he was already thinking about leaving the dealership, that a new figure stepped in. She approached with a calm and confident demeanor, with a genuine smile that stood out in the environment. Emma White, the receptionist, approached Henry with an aura of competence and empathy. Unlike Mark and James, she seemed to immediately sense that something was wrong. She didn't rush to approach him impersonally. Instead, her approach was warm, polite, but without the condescension of the others. "Hello, sir. Can I help you with something?" Emma asked, her voice soft but with a firmness that exuded confidence. Henry couldn't help but notice the difference in her attitude. It was as if, instead of being treated as a mere customer, he was seen as a person, and not just a potential buyer, to be convinced. Those simple, unhurried words made Henry immediately relax a little. The frustration he felt was softened by the attentive way Emma approached him. There was no judgment in her eyes, nor an expression of doubt about his purchasing power, as he had seen in the other salespeople. Emma treated him with the respect he believed he deserved, and that brought him instant relief. "Actually, yes. I was waiting to see the most expensive model in the store. The other salespeople..." Henry hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully not to sound too bitter, but the pain of being ignored was still clear in his voice. "They didn't show me what I wanted to see. I just wanted to see the luxury model." Emma listened attentively, without interrupting, and when he finished speaking, she simply nodded. She didn't seem surprised or uncomfortable with what he said, as if the situation was just part of her job. But her reaction was entirely different from anything Henry had experienced up to that point. "Of course, sir. Don't worry. I'll see what I can do to help you. One moment, please," Emma said, with a reassuring smile and an understanding expression. She turned to go to the car display area and, unlike Mark, who always seemed irritated or impatient, Emma walked with grace and confidence, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing and, more importantly, knew how to treat people. Henry watched as she walked away, with a posture that seemed to be the very definition of professionalism. There was no rush in her actions, nor arrogance. It was as if she was there to ensure he received the best possible service, no matter what others thought. He stood still for a moment, reflecting on the striking difference between Emma and the other salespeople. While Mark and James saw him as just a common customer, Emma treated him with dignity and respect, regardless of his appearance or the clothes he wore. It was a simple gesture but very significant for him, who rarely received that kind of attention. She returned a few minutes later, with a tablet in hand, looking focused on what she was doing. Her gaze met Henry's again, and this time, there was a softness in her smile that seemed to indicate she understood what he was feeling. "Mr. Smith, right?" she asked with a smile, almost as if she already knew him, although he hadn't identified himself with his last name. Henry was surprised by her accuracy. The way she treated him seemed to indicate she was doing more than just following a procedure. Emma wasn't just offering a product, she was genuinely trying to provide the best experience possible. This attention to detail intrigued him. "Yes, that's me," Henry replied, now with a more curious tone, as if he had found someone who genuinely understood the situation. "How did you know my name?" Emma smiled calmly. "It's part of my job, sir, to know our customers and help them in the best way possible. And of course, I care about everyone's experience. I want you to feel comfortable here, without rush and without pressure." Henry observed her for a moment, reflecting on her words. He had already begun to realize that respect in customer service shouldn't be tied to judgments about what he seemed to be, but about who he really was. Emma didn't care about his appearance or what he might seem to be. She was interested in what he wanted, without prejudice. "I found the most expensive model available here," Emma continued, already with a list of options in front of her. "Would you like to take a look? And if you want, we can schedule a test drive." The proposal of a test drive wasn't just a formality, it was a sincere suggestion. Emma wasn't just trying to sell a car. She wanted to ensure that Henry had the complete experience, that he could feel the quality of the car before making any decision. Henry felt a slight smile appear on the corner of his lips. He realized that his experience at the store, up to that moment full of frustration, could finally take a positive turn. "Yes, I'd like to take a test drive, and if possible, I'd like to see the car in detail before that." "Certainly, sir," Emma promptly responded, and then gestured for him to follow her to the model. "Please, follow me." As they walked towards the car, Henry thought about the irony of the situation. He was there at that moment, being treated with a dignity he hadn't imagined finding in a place like that, where everything around him seemed to be driven by status and appearance. Emma, with her calm and attentive behavior, seemed to be the only person in the store who truly saw him as a person, not as an external figure to a world that only considered those who could pay for their products. He felt, in a way, renewed. His perspective on people, on customer service, on the importance of treating others with respect and consideration, was being shaped differently. And Emma, without even knowing it, was giving him an important lesson at that very moment. The days following Henry's first encounter with Emma at luxury cars were filled with reflections. The experience had been surprising for him, not only because of how he was treated by Mark and James, but by the way Emma stood out from the other employees. She not only treated him with respect, but also with the kindness of someone who genuinely cares about providing good service. That interaction had planted a seed inside him, an idea that the business world could, in fact, be different, fairer, and more humane. But Henry was not naive. He knew the system was flawed, and he was determined to make a real change. He wanted to ensure that other customers wouldn't go through what he had experienced, and luxury cars would be the starting point for that. He knew the best way to do this was to reverse the way service was conducted, showing the salespeople, especially Mark and James, that a simple, disdainful look could have serious consequences, and he would do it in a way that would leave a lasting impression. The next morning, Henry woke up with a renewed purpose. The sun in Los Angeles was bright, but he didn't mind the heat or humidity. He put on his simplest clothes, those that went unnoticed: a light blue cotton shirt, beige pants, and discreet shoes. He didn't want his appearance to be the focus, but his attitude, his presence. He didn't want to be treated as someone with visible status or purchasing power. He wanted to be treated with the dignity that every human being deserves. Henry walked into luxury cars again, with a sense of anticipation, knowing exactly what he was going to do. This time, he wouldn't hide behind a disguise. Henry was no longer the simple man. He knew who he was, and he was ready to reveal it. When he entered the store, the environment didn't seem different. The shine of the cars, the gleaming marble floors, and the soft sound of background music set the tone of sophistication that luxury cars tried to project. But to Henry, all of this now seemed superficial, like a shiny cover hiding the true essence of the place. He observed Mark and James again. They were sitting at the counter, talking indifferently, apparently unaware of anything around them. Henry approached unhurriedly, but with a firm step, his posture more upright, a bit more confidence in his walk. He knew what was about to happen, and it excited and unsettled him at the same time. He was about to test the convictions of those salesmen. Mark was the first to see him approaching, but didn't seem interested in anything beyond his conversation with James. He continued talking while shaking his head, not even looking at Henry. "Hi, can I help you with something?" Mark finally asked, after a long silence, with the same bored and uninterested tone as before. His questions seemed to be a formality, without any real effort to understand Henry's need. It wasn't a friendly greeting, it was more an attempt to get rid of someone who was probably just another common customer. Henry, hearing Mark's disdainful tone, didn't rush to respond. He just stopped in front of him, observing him for a moment without saying anything. The tension in the room began to grow, and Mark, unaware of what was about to happen, continued talking to James, distracted. When Henry finally broke the silence, his voice was low, but full of a calm that didn't match the anxiety he felt inside. "I need to speak with the manager. My name is Henry Smith." Mark, who was about to turn back to James, froze for a second. He wasn't prepared to hear that name, and immediately his eyes widened with an expression of disbelief. He looked at James, who still hadn't noticed what was happening. James, in turn, raised his distracted eyes, beginning to realize that something was wrong. "Sorry, what?" Mark repeated, trying to process the information. He looked Henry up and down with a doubtful expression. He didn't believe what he was hearing. He thought maybe Henry was just joking or making some kind of prank. "Henry Smith," Henry said again, this time more firmly, as if the name carried more weight. He could see that Mark was beginning to get unsettled, but he didn't care. "I'm the owner of Smith Holdings, and luxury cars is part of my investment portfolio." The silence in the room was absolute. Mark was speechless. He looked at James, who was now standing from his chair, with his eyes fixed on Henry. The two salesmen were clearly in shock, and what previously seemed like a normal work situation was now completely out of control. Henry was no longer the common man they had ignored. He was the person who owned luxury cars, or at least had the final say on what would happen there. Henry observed their reaction, but didn't care about the discomfort he was causing. He knew it needed to happen. They needed to understand the seriousness of what was happening. The fact that they were arrogant and disrespectful salesmen towards customers should not go unnoticed. "I came here to do business," Henry continued, his voice calm but loaded with authority. "But not with you. I've seen enough." He paused, letting the words weigh. "Luxury cars needs to change the way it treats its customers. I can't and won't allow disdain and indifference to prevail here." Mark and James were now visibly uncomfortable, and Henry knew he had hit a sensitive spot. He wasn't there just to buy a car. He was there to transform the way things were done, to correct the errors and restore a standard of respect and professionalism. "Now, I want to speak with the manager," Henry said, his voice without a shadow of doubt. "Robert Johnson. I won't wait any longer. I want the changes to start now." At that moment, Emma, who was at the reception, watched the scene with a keen eye. She couldn't help but smile to herself, feeling that finally something good might come out of all this tension. She somehow already knew that Henry wasn't just another common customer. He was someone who could really make a difference. And now she felt that the change he was starting to bring would be a significant turning point for everyone. The tension still hung in the air as Henry finally left the counter and headed for the manager's office. Mark and James were clearly unsettled, trying to recover from the shock of the revelation. They knew they had made a grave mistake, but they could do nothing but watch as Henry walked firmly, determined, toward the next step of his mission. Emma, in turn, kept her eyes fixed on Henry. She felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What would he do next? She knew the situation was already well out of control, but at the same time, She was relieved to see that someone was finally doing something to change that culture of disrespect. Robert Johnson's office, the manager of luxury cars, was on the second floor of the dealership. Unlike the rest of the store, which was more modern and luxurious, the office had a more sober and formal decoration, with heavy furniture and a large mahogany desk. The environment seemed to reflect the seriousness with which Robert dealt with the dealership's business. Henry entered without hesitation. Robert was sitting behind his desk, focused on papers, when he looked up and saw the man he knew must be important. Henry Smith. But what he didn't know was what had happened to make him come there. "Mr. Smith, can I help you with something?" Robert asked, with a courteous smile. But there was something in the tone of his voice that indicated he was trying to understand what was happening. Henry, without wasting time, got straight to the point. "I'm here to talk about the future of luxury cars, Robert, and more specifically, about the dealership's relationship with Car World Motors." Robert raised his eyebrows. "Car World Motors?" He was clearly surprised. "What does that have to do with you, Mr. Smith?" Henry didn't hesitate. "I own Smith Holdings, and luxury cars is part of my investment portfolio. I'm the one who decides the future of this company now, and if the salespeople here aren't treated seriously, if the disdainful behavior toward customers continues, luxury cars can lose much more than just an important customer." Robert stood up, now visibly more attentive to the situation. He knew that Car World Motors was one of the dealership's most valuable partnerships, providing a large portion of the luxury cars they sold. The idea of losing this partnership not only put the store's sales at risk, but also its reputation in the market. I didn't know there was anything wrong with the service," said Robert, with a more defensive tone. "We always treat our customers with the utmost respect." Henry looked directly at him. "I was treated indifferently, almost with scorn, by Salesman, Mark and James. They believed I didn't have the money to buy the most expensive cars in the store, simply because of the way I was dressed. And if this happens to any other customer, the situation will get even worse." Robert's expression changed to one of concern. He already knew that the behavior of the salesman could be problematic, but now it was clear that the consequences would be much more serious than he had imagined. "I understand, but what does this have to do with Car World Motors?" Robert asked, trying to understand the link between the salesman's attitude and the partnership with the supplier. Henry sighed deeply. "Car World Motors is very strict with its partners. They do not tolerate negligence in customer service, and if they find out that luxury cars is failing to give due attention to its customers, the partnership will be suspended. They are already beginning to notice the lack of professionalism in some of your dealerships, and if nothing changes, they will cut the supply of cars." Robert was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He knew that losing Car World Motors would mean a devastating blow to luxury cars business. The situation was more serious than he had initially imagined. Losing this partnership would mean not only an immediate financial impact, but also an irreparable stain on the dealership's image. "I didn't know the situation was that serious. I need to do something now to avoid this disaster." "What do you suggest, Henry?" Robert asked, now more concerned than ever. Henry looked at him, evaluating the situation. "I suggest that luxury cars undergo a complete overhaul of customer service. It starts with management, Robert. The salespeople need to be trained. They need to understand that a customer's appearance doesn't define their purchasing power, and certainly not their worth as a person. Respect must be non-negotiable." Robert nodded, understanding the seriousness of Henry's words. He knew that something had to be done immediately to avoid the imminent disaster. He also knew that without changes, luxury cars would no longer be seen as a high-end dealership. And above all, that could not happen. "I will act immediately. I will gather the entire team and start a training program focused on customer service, emphasizing respect and ethics. And I will speak with Car World Motors to ensure they see our commitment to improvement," said Robert, now more resolute. "And I will personally talk to Mark and James about their behavior." Henry looked at him with approval. "That's a good start. But remember, real changes only happen when everyone, from leadership to frontline employees, truly commits to them. The future of luxury cars depends on it. As Henry stood up to leave the office, he felt a slight sense of relief. He knew he had taken the first step in transforming the dealership and ensuring that customer respect was finally put first. More than that, he had done it with the power of his own experience and with the firmness that others, like Mark and James, needed to learn to value. After the decisive meeting with Robert Johnson, Henry Smith knew that the path to transforming luxury cars would be arduous. He wasn't just offering a quick fix, he was committed to a complete restructuring of how employees treated customers. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was a necessary action if the dealership wanted to survive in the long term and maintain its reputation in the luxury car market. In the luxury cars office, the tension was palpable. The salespeople, especially Mark and James, were aware that the situation was serious. They were beginning to realize that the way they had treated customers until that point wasn't just a matter of sales style, but something that could destroy their careers and the dealership itself. But there was something even more disturbing: the weight of Henry's pressure, who undoubtedly intended to do whatever it took to correct his team's mistakes. Robert Johnson, the store manager, was visibly worried. He knew that Henry was now in control, and any misstep could result in irreversible consequences. In his mind, he was already beginning to imagine how to implement the changes Henry demanded. He also understood that these transformations needed to be immediate and deep, not just superficial. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type love if you've made it this far. Now, let's get back to the story. The following day, the luxury cars conference room was filled with salespeople, sales assistants, and managers, all gathered for the first stage of training. Emma, with her reliable and serene demeanor, was at the front, ready to lead the session. She knew this was her chance to shine, but she was also aware of the responsibility she had. She was the leader of the re-education program and knew that if the salespeople didn't adapt, they would lose more than just the chance to improve their skills. They would lose their jobs. The training began with a simple but powerful dynamic. Emma asked the participants to sit in circles, observing each other. "Let's start with something simple," she said, her voice calm and confident. "I want each of you to share an experience where you felt disrespected or devalued. It doesn't have to be something related to the dealership, but something you've experienced personally." Silence took over the room for a few seconds. Some employees looked at each other, hesitant. They weren't used to opening up their feelings, especially in a corporate environment. But Emma, with patience, encouraged them to speak. When one of the salespeople, Lucas, shared an experience of being ignored in a restaurant because of his simple appearance, many others began to open up. Others reported situations of social discrimination, class prejudice, and even disrespect in other areas of their lives. Emma smiled, realizing that the dynamic was working. "What did you feel when you heard these stories? How could these situations have been different if people had been more empathetic and respectful?" The response was almost unanimous. People in the room recognized that they could have done more to welcome others, and that empathy was essential to creating a trusting environment. "Exactly," continued Emma. "Empathy and respect are fundamental for us to provide the quality service our customers deserve. Remember, people don't just buy cars for the product, but for the experience they receive when making the purchase. If we want to sell a luxury car, we need to treat each customer as if they were the most important person in our life." The dynamic extended for over an hour, and Emma noticed that many of the salespeople were beginning to change their stance. They were no longer seeing service as a mere exchange of money for product. They began to see the true value of the service they were offering. But there was an even greater challenge ahead. Real change would come when these salespeople needed to apply this empathy in their daily service. After the training, Henry met again with Robert and Daniel in his office to discuss the next steps. He knew the path was just beginning, but he felt the seeds of change were already being planted. "Robert, the training was just the first step," said Henry firmly. Now, we need to ensure these changes are implemented every day, in every interaction with customers. It's not enough for the salespeople to know what to do. They need to be constantly evaluated to ensure this transformation is lasting. Daniel, by his side, agreed with Henry. And more, Henry. We need to ensure that the leaders of each section are examples. If a manager doesn't demonstrate the behavior we expect from the salespeople, nothing will change. This needs to come from the top down. Henry looked at Robert seriously. You will be responsible for ensuring that the training program continues, but I also want a feedback system where customers can evaluate the service they received. I want to know if we're really fulfilling our promise of transformation. Robert nodded, knowing that what was being proposed was an ongoing effort. He could no longer allow situations like those of Mark and James to repeat themselves. Understood. I will implement an anonymous evaluation system where customers can give their feedback directly on the service. And we will ensure the team is regularly trained to reinforce the principles of respect and empathy. In the following days, Emma led new training and follow-up sessions. She also began working closely with the salespeople, helping them understand how to apply the lessons in practical situations. When Mark and James arrived for the second round of training, they were the most reluctant, but they were also beginning to understand that their previous attitudes would no longer be tolerated. The disdain with which they had treated Henry, who had disguised himself as a simple customer, now seemed unthinkable to them. They were beginning to see how it affected the dealership's success. The pressure from Henry and Daniel to ensure real changes caused luxury cars to undergo a cultural transformation. But there was also an essential component that could not be ignored: the results. Each interaction with customers was now an opportunity for the dealership to demonstrate the value of its changes. And gradually, this would begin to reflect in sales, customer satisfaction, and eventually in how luxury cars was recognized in the market. After the meeting, where Henry made it clear that the salespeople's behavior would not be tolerated, the atmosphere at luxury cars was tenser than ever. Robert, the dealership manager, knew this was one of the most challenging situations of his career. As responsible for maintaining order and the smooth operation of the store, he found himself under pressure to implement quick and effective changes without yielding to the resistance that was beginning to arise among the salespeople. Mark and James, still visibly upset about the situation, were beginning to realize the gravity of the consequences of their actions. But for now, they tried to maintain their arrogant postures. Both couldn't understand how the simple act of mocking a customer had turned into something so serious. Deep down, they knew they had made a mistake, but denial was a defense mechanism. When Henry walked into the room where the meeting was about to take place, his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't a man of many words. When he wanted something done, he made sure it was done, no matter the cost. Looking at Mark and James, it was clear he had already made his decision. There would be no more room for excuses. Robert, who was already visibly uncomfortable with what he had to do, took a deep breath before starting the conversation. Mark, James, you know why we are here. Your behavior in customer service was completely unacceptable. I know both of you are good salespeople, but this is no longer about your ability to close deals. It's about how you treat the people who walk in here. Mark tried to interrupt, but Robert raised his hand for silence. It was clear he would no longer tolerate any excuses. You cannot simply look at a customer and decide they don't deserve our attention just because they're not wearing a designer suit or driving an expensive car. Your behavior has not only damaged the image of luxury cars, but also jeopardized our partnership with Car World Motors. And, as we all know, without this partnership, we won't have the cars that our customers want to buy. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mark was beginning to feel the weight of the responsibility he carried. No matter how much he tried to justify his stance, he knew his attitude had been completely wrong. But before he could speak, James, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke up. I just wanted to sell a car, Robert. That customer seemed too simple for what we were offering. I thought it wasn't worth wasting time on him. James spoke hesitantly, still trying to find a justification for his actions. Henry, who had been observing the scene in silence, intervened. His voice, always firm and controlled, made everyone in the room stop to listen to him. "James, if you think a customer's appearance defines their value, then you're in the wrong place. At Luxury Cars, we treat all our customers with respect. End of story. You and Mark not only failed to serve a customer, but showed an unacceptable level of disrespect. We're not talking about an occasional mistake. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that cannot continue." He paused, looking intently at both salesmen. "The decision has been made. You will be suspended for a week. During this time, you will have to reflect on what happened and, more importantly, undergo re-education. It's not just about how to sell cars. It's about how to treat people. And if, after this suspension, you don't show that you understand the gravity of the situation, you will no longer have a place here." The sentence was given. Mark and James tried to protest, but Robert quickly cut them off. "This is final. There are no more discussions." In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Luxury Cars began to change. Emma, who had already been in charge of training all the employees, saw this as an opportunity not only to correct Mark and James's behavior, but also to show all the salespeople how customer respect should be a priority. She knew that the suspension could be seen as a punishment, but it would also be a chance for transformation for the entire dealership. With the suspension in effect, Mark and James were removed from the sales environment. Emma organized individual reflection sessions with them, in which they deeply discussed the impact of their attitudes. But most of the work would be done through intensive training, focused on empathy, communication, and the concept of selling with heart. Emma, with her natural leadership skills, conducted these sessions in an almost therapeutic way. "You think customers come here just to buy a car, right?" Emma asked in one of the first sessions. "But what if I told you that for many of them, the buying experience is more important than the product itself? It's not just about closing the sale, it's about building a relationship." Mark, who was beginning to feel the first effects of the training, seemed more attentive. He knew he had made a mistake, but he was starting to understand the reason for his failure. "I didn't realize I was being so insensitive. I really thought only money mattered," Mark said with a tone of regret. He was beginning to realize how superficial his approach had been all along. "Exactly," said Emma. "What happened with you and James wasn't just a failure of judgment. It was a failure of humanity. And if Luxury Cars wants to continue being a respected name, we have to be more than salespeople. We have to be trusted consultants. When customers come in here, they're not just buying a car. They're looking for something that reflects who they are, their values, and that includes the service they receive." Henry, in turn, closely monitored the salesman's progress. He knew that transforming Luxury Cars would not be a quick process. But seeing Emma's efforts and how she dedicated herself to teaching the salespeople to look at customers differently, he felt the dealership was finally on the right track. During this period, Daniel also played a crucial role in reinforcing the importance of a culture of mutual respect within the organization. He knew that changes wouldn't happen just through training. They needed to be embedded in the company's philosophy as a whole. So, he organized weekly meetings with team leaders to ensure that the new service model was implemented not only on paper, but in daily practice. When Mark and James's suspension ended, Luxury Cars had changed, and so had they. Although there were still remnants of resistance in their attitudes, they knew they couldn't return to their old behavior. Every interaction with customers was now an opportunity to prove they had truly learned the lesson. Henry, Robert, Emma, and Daniel closely observed the progress of all the employees. It wasn't just Mark and James who needed to adapt. Everyone at the dealership was being challenged to adopt a new stance. For Luxury Cars to remain relevant in the market and, more importantly, regain the trust of its customers, the change needed to be genuine and lasting. The suspension and re-education of the salesman was therefore a turning point. What could have been a simple punishment turned into a turning point for the entire company. And although Luxury Cars still had a long way to go, the first signs of a promising future were beginning to appear. With the progress of changes at luxury cars, Henry and Emma began to see each other more frequently. Emma was not only a key player in the new customer service program, but had also become someone Henry admired and respected deeply. She was dedicated, competent, and most importantly, shared the same vision of transformation for the dealership. Since the issue with the salesman was resolved, the atmosphere in the store was in a transition phase. The team was adapting to the new sales model, and Emma had become an informal leader as her management style inspired confidence. Henry, who had always had a more direct and impersonal approach to his business, began to notice the seriousness with which she committed to each task. He knew it was difficult to maintain everyone's motivation during such an intense restructuring phase, but Emma seemed to have a natural talent for it. She had a strong yet gentle presence, and an ability to make everyone feel they were part of something bigger. One quiet afternoon, at the end of a long workday, Henry invited her to talk. They were in the main office of the dealership, away from the busy sales area, and the atmosphere was more relaxed. Emma was organizing some reports when Henry entered the room. He was casually dressed, but even so, his presence seemed to fill the space. Emma looked up, and seeing him, she sensed that he was there for something more important than just business. "Emma, you have done an admirable job here. I've been observing the effort you've put into every step of this transformation," Henry said, his voice calm but full of sincerity. He had always been direct, but on this occasion, his words had a softer, more personal tone. Emma felt a warmth in her chest from the compliment, but she was also slightly disconcerted. She wasn't used to this kind of recognition, especially coming from someone like Henry. She had always seen him as a focused and impersonal businessman, more concerned with numbers and results than with people. And now he was speaking in a way that indicated he really saw something more in her, something that transcended her role. "Thank you, Henry," Emma replied with a genuine smile, but trying to stay focused. "I'm just doing what needs to be done to ensure everything works as best as possible. We still have a lot of work ahead of us." Henry nodded, recognizing her humility, but he couldn't help but feel that she was giving her all to what was happening at luxury cars. "You know, you've been more than just a customer service manager, right? You've been the person who brought stability to this team. You've guided not only the salespeople, but also me through many difficult situations." Emma looked at him in surprise. She had never imagined he thought of her role in that way. To her, it was simply a matter of doing the job as best as possible. Nothing was more gratifying for her than seeing the transformation happening, but the fact that Henry was truly seeing the depth of her effort touched her in an unexpected way. "I just didn't know you saw me like that," Emma said, her eyes fixed on Henry. "I thought you were more focused on other matters. But if you think I'm really helping, then that means a lot to me. Luxury cars needs more than expensive cars. It needs a culture of respect and trust, and I truly believe in that." Henry smiled. "I see that in you, Emma. That's why I want you to know something that's been on my mind. I'm negotiating to buy luxury cars, and when that happens, I'll need someone like you by my side. I want you to be a fundamental part of this new phase." Emma's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She knew Henry had invested a lot of time and energy into this company, but the idea of him buying the dealership seemed entirely beyond her imagination. "You're buying the company?" Emma asked, with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "I didn't know it was so close. But what about our customer service approach? Do you really believe we can expand this vision to other stores?" Henry nodded firmly. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. I want luxury cars to become a model of excellence in customer service. And for that, I need people like you to lead this change. You've shown that beyond the numbers, true transformation comes from a humanized approach. And that's what I want to implement not just here, but in other branches as well. I know you can help me with this." Emma felt a wave of emotions wash over her. It was hard to believe that someone like Henry so focused on the financial side, saw customer service transformation as a priority. It made her realize how aligned she was with his vision. It wasn't just about making money. It was about creating something lasting, something that made a difference in people's lives. I would love to help, Henry, but this is a huge responsibility. I'm not just talking about service, but about creating an entire culture that respects the customer in an authentic way. I can't do this alone. You'll be by my side, right? Henry looked her in the eyes without hesitation. Yes, I'll be by your side. I want you to be the leader of this change. Together, we can create a network of stores that sets the standard, where every customer feels valued. And not just another sale. This is what I see for the future of luxury cars. And that's why you need to be by my side, Emma. Those words were filled with a sincerity Emma never imagined hearing from Henry. He wasn't the type of man who easily expressed his feelings. But there, at that moment, she saw that he was truly committed to the vision they were sharing. And it meant more than any bonus or promotion. Silence settled between them for a moment, before Emma finally said, "If you believe in me, Henry, then I believe in you. Let's make this happen. Let's transform luxury cars from just another name into a market leader. Let's do something big." Henry smiled, a genuine smile, as if he had finally found the right partner for the vision he had for the future. "I knew I could count on you, Emma. Let's make history together." As the new management model of luxury cars gained momentum, with Henry and Emma at the helm, the dealership seemed to be in a phase of renewal. Sales began to stabilize, and customer service was gradually improved. However, there was growing tension behind the scenes, something the two leaders couldn't ignore. The voices of resistance that started to rise against the change. It was no longer the open criticism of the older salespeople, but something darker, something that moved in the shadows. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type "juice" if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. Now, let's continue with the story. At the heart of this resistance were Mark and James. Despite having been corrected for their past behavior and suspended for their destructive attitude, they were not entirely willing to accept the new philosophy of luxury cars. To Mark, the changes were an affront to the way he had always done business. He believed that with his experience, he should dictate the sales rules in the dealership, not a customer service philosophy that seemed like a useless distraction to him. James, though more reserved, shared many of the same opinions and, perhaps feeling inferior to Mark in terms of experience, followed his lead. The two began to plot behind the scenes. It started with discreet conversations over breakfast, when Mark met with some other employees. Initially, they were just innocent comments about how sales had dropped a bit since the new customer service approach had been implemented. Mark suggested that luxury cars was losing focus on its sales, that the sales team was no longer as energetic, as if the new model was draining their motivation. James, always more careful, voiced his support, saying it might be time to reassess the changes that had been imposed without proper analysis of the numbers. "Have you noticed how sales targets have started to fall, Mark?" James asked, in a tone that tried to be discreetly concerned, but with a certain satisfaction in his words. "I'm not against the idea of treating customers well, but wouldn't it be good to go back to something that worked before? I know customers like to be well treated, but numbers don't lie." Mark, who shared the same view, nodded. "I noticed it too, James. And the worst part is that they don't even realize it's affecting our commissions. Our numbers drop, and they only talk about customer relationships, but that doesn't pay the bills. I don't know how much longer this will last, honestly. These new methods aren't working." Their plan began to take shape when Mark suggested they start creating a narrative of internal crisis. Something subtle but convincing enough to shake the other salespeople's confidence and eventually affect Henry and Emma's trust. They knew the heart of luxury cars wasn't in the cars but in its sales team, and undermining the employees' morale was the key to toppling Henry and Emma's authority. If they could sow doubt about the effectiveness of the changes, they could create fertile ground for a possible turnaround. James suggested they speak with customers indirectly, without alarming them or being aggressive, but just enough to create a sense of uncertainty. They began to insinuate, very carefully, that luxury cars was going through difficulties, especially behind the scenes, without revealing much, but leaving the impression that the company was in a sort of difficult transition. Comments like, "I've heard things aren't going so well around here," or "I hope the company can keep this up for longer," began to spread, always with a suggestion that the change might not be sustainable. What Mark and James didn't know was that while they were busy with their conspiracy, Emma was vigilant. She had always had a keen eye for details, and with the experience she had accumulated since taking on the role of manager, she began to notice something was wrong. Frequent customers didn't seem as satisfied as before. Some mentioned something about luxury cars not being what it used to be, as if there was something strange in the store's atmosphere. Emma knew these small observations couldn't be ignored, especially since they were related to the public's perception of the company. She felt uneasy, starting to connect the dots. It was during one of her daily visits to the sales area, while talking with some salespeople, that Emma heard a comment that alerted her. One of the salespeople mentioned that some of his colleagues were talking about unmet sales targets and how that could mean a crisis. Emma wasn't sure what was happening, but she immediately realized this narrative wasn't coming from a common person. There was something planned, almost like a coordinated campaign to discredit the changes at luxury cars. The first person she thought of was Mark, and then James. Their behavior didn't surprise her, but the fact that they were starting to act so openly and coordinated worried her. Emma couldn't let this grow. She decided to investigate more deeply without confronting them directly, to prevent them from knowing she was already suspicious. She began to talk more with other team members, discreetly asking about the work environment, whether there was any dissatisfaction or distrust regarding the company's direction. Gradually, the pieces began to fit together. She realized the resistance wasn't just an aversion to change, but something more personal, something aimed at discrediting Henry's leadership and undermining his authority. That's when she finally met with Henry, explaining the situation. "Henry, I've noticed something strange. There's a conspiracy happening here. Mark and James are trying to undermine the team's confidence, spreading rumors and creating an environment of uncertainty. I've heard many comments about how sales have dropped and how the new philosophy isn't working, and it's all coming from a small group, led by them." Henry listened attentively, his expression growing more serious. He knew there were internal challenges to be faced, but hadn't imagined the resistance was so well organized. "Are you sure about this, Emma? We can't let this escalate. We need to act quickly." Emma, with the same determination she always showed, devised a plan to confront Mark and James directly. She called them to a meeting, knowing this would be the opportunity to put an end to the silent sabotage happening once and for all. After months of hard work, facing internal challenges and overcoming obstacles, luxury cars was finally achieving stability. The customer service that Emma implemented had changed the company's dynamics. The team was more engaged, customers were satisfied, and sales began showing signs of recovery. But the most significant wasn't just the company's success, but the personal transformation that had occurred in both Emma and Henry. The change at the dealership symbolized much more than just a corporate rebirth. It also reflected the evolution of Emma and Henry's relationship. Initially, they were just colleagues, with a bond based on professional trust. But over time, with the challenges they faced together, something deeper began to develop. They had supported each other, faced obstacles collaboratively, and this only strengthened the respect and admiration they felt for each other. Although Emma had always been focused on her career, her relationship with Henry began to gain new meaning. He wasn't just a boss or a business partner. He was becoming someone with whom she shared not only work challenges, but also more personal moments, like conversations over lunch, or the knowing looks they exchanged during meetings. Henry, in turn, also began to realize that his bond with Emma went beyond the professional sphere. He not only admired how competent and passionate she was about her work, but also began to see her differently, as someone who could be his life partner. The day Henry decided to propose to Emma, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He wanted to show her how crucial her presence had been, not just for the dealership's success, but for his own personal happiness. Emma had been the key to turning luxury cars around, and Henry knew his life now made no sense without her by his side, not just as a colleague, but as a partner. It was a hot summer afternoon in Miami. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. Emma was finishing her shift, reviewing some documents at her desk, when Henry walked into her office. He was calmer than usual, but there was a different energy about him, a slight tension that Emma immediately noticed. "Emma," he said with a gentle smile, "we need to talk." She looked at him, curious, but also a little apprehensive. It was rare for Henry to request a conversation outside of scheduled meetings, and she wondered what he wanted. She gestured for him to sit in the chair in front of her. "Sure, what happened?" Emma asked, trying to read his expression. Henry took a deep breath before responding. He seemed serene, but there was a sparkle in his eyes, something Emma couldn't quite identify. "I've been thinking. After everything we've been through, everything we've done together, both professionally and personally, I feel there's something more between us, not just a work partnership." Emma frowned. He was being so serious. "What do you mean by that?" She wasn't prepared for what was coming, but his words were starting to create a sense of anticipation. Henry hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he stood up and went to the drawer of his desk. She watched as he took out a small black velvet box, which he opened delicately, revealing a diamond ring. The ring shimmered softly under the room's light, reflecting the intensity of the moment. "Emma," he said, now with a firm but emotional voice, "I've spent my whole life trying to understand what really matters. I've always focused on work, numbers, success. But then you came into my life and showed me that the most important thing is relationships, partnership, trust, and yes, love. You helped me see the world in a different way, and I can't imagine my life without you by my side anymore." Do you believe that the transformation at luxury cars was a reflection of the growing relationship between Emma and Henry? What made Henry decide to propose to Emma just when everything was falling into place in their lives? Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to follow all our stories and check out more exciting stories by clicking here on the final screen.